Hi everybody, so we're going to start watching The Great Escape soon, which is a really famous film, a massive film from the 1960s, sort of set in World War II. So let's have a look before we begin to watch it. Alright, so before you do watch you need a little bit of background because some of you might not know enough about World War II. So the film was made in 1964, set during World War II as we said. It was based on the true story of the attempted mass escape of a huge number of prisoners of war in the spring of 1943 from a Nazi camp called Stalag Luft III. So the Nazis used to build all these camps in order to keep the prisoners that they captured safe so that they couldn't escape. And that's what this film is about. It's about a bunch of those prisoners who are trying to get out of that jail that they're kept in. There were 73 escapees altogether, but the story does not end the same way for all of them. Okay, so there's a couple of twists at the end. It was one of the most daring escapes of the Second World War, so it was a true story. The story itself was actually written by an Australian prisoner of war. It was a book, so the film was based on a book written by this Australian who'd had to live through it and knew what happened with the escape. So what was a prisoner of war? During World War II, many prisoners were taken prisoner by the other side. So the Allies, who included those from countries like Britain, Australia, New Zealand and America, if captured, were placed in a camp and held for long periods of time. Now some of you might know up in this top corner here who these guys are, just from that horrible symbol there. Alright, so the swastika is what the symbol's called, and they are Nazis. So they were the Germans during World War II, who the Allies, so people like Britain and Australia, were fighting against. So if they were captured, it was against the rules to hurt a prisoner of war, or what we call a PoW. So many lives, or so many people lived in the camp for years, awaiting the end of the war because they weren't set free. So some of them were used for ransom. If they were able to capture a really high-ranking officer, then they would use that to try and bargain their way into getting their own prisoners back, or, you know, all sorts of things. Many of the POWs would try to escape, however, rather than have to wait for the war to end in the camp, because they didn't know when the war was going to end. So The Great Escape is based on the story of the Allied airmen, or pilots, who were captured and placed in one camp to make sure they couldn't escape. So these were really smart guys, and the Germans knew they were smart, and they were really good at escaping from other camps. So the Germans built this big camp called Stalag Luft III, and they put all of these airmen into that one camp. Not the best idea, but they thought it was. Alright, so what was it like? For a POW, all camps were different. They were run by officers who were really sympathetic and nice, or who were cruel. So many of the German soldiers and the Allies in Stalag Luft III, which is the camp we're looking at, they got on pretty well. The airmen were allowed to grow vegetables, which we see up here, to feed themselves. They were given cards so they could keep themselves entertained, and they were allowed to set up choirs to pass the time. Okay, so they were allowed to do things that not everyone in other camps was allowed to do. But the bottom line was that it was still a jail. So we can see down here kind of what it looks like. We've got our tower where the Nazis would stand ready with their guns in case anyone wanted to escape over these big barbed wire fences. If men stepped out of line, they were subjected to solitary confinement, which was called the cooler. So it was basically, you know, locked away in a little cell by yourself for however many weeks they thought you deserved. There are some stories of men who were beaten and food being withheld if the Germans were unhappy. So many of the Allies didn't wish to stay, obviously. It was their need to escape that led them to digging tunnels, which would eventually lead to the story of the Great Escape. So there's a little bit of background into POWs, why they were kept prisoner, and so it gives you a little bit of context as to what the characters in the Great Escape were going through. Okay, so let's watch the film.